The Habsburg jaw protruded so far from young Charles II's face that he couldn't close his mouth or chew solid food. His tongue was so swollen it filled his entire oral cavity, making speech nearly impossible. But the jaw wasn't the worst part. It was just the most visible symptom of a genetic curse that had been slowly destroying one of Europe's most powerful royal families for 3 centuries. This isn't a story about ancient mythology or supernatural curses. This is the documented case of how one family's obsession with keeping their bloodline pure transformed them into a living laboratory of genetic horror. Today, you'll discover how the House of Habsburg systematically bred themselves into extinction, creating human beings so genetically damaged that they could barely function as living organisms. You think you know what inbreeding can do? You think you understand the consequences of genetic isolation? What you're about to discover will redefine your understanding of both heredity and human arrogance. Because the Habsburg curse wasn't inflicted by enemies or disease, it was a fate they chose for themselves, generation after generation, even as they watched their own children transform into barely recognizable human beings. But to understand how a family became their own worst enemy, we must first meet the dynasty that ruled half of Europe. The House of Habsburg was everything medieval Europe aspired to become. For over 6 centuries, they ruled the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, Austria, Hungary, and vast territories across 4 continents. Their palaces were architectural marvels, their art collections priceless, their military might unquestionable. Were the most successful royal dynasty in European history, wielding power that modern minds can barely comprehend. This marriage strategy made them incredibly wealthy and politically dominant. Habsburg brides and grooms were the most sought after marriage partners in Europe. Their weddings were international events that determined the fate of nations. When a Habsburg married, borders shifted, alliances formed. The balance of European power restructured itself around their unions. The family took immense pride in their bloodline's purity. They viewed themselves as divinely appointed rulers, genetically superior to other royal families. Their genealogists traced their lineage back to legendary figures, creating elaborate family trees that emphasized their unique breeding and noble heritage. They genuinely believed their blood was different, better, bad than that of ordinary mortals. But their obsession with preserving this superior bloodline would soon reveal itself as the most catastrophic decision in royal history. The very strategy that built their empire would ultimately destroy both their dynasty and their humanity. The first hints of genetic trouble appeared in the early 1400s, but they were subtle enough to be explained away as coincidence. Habsburg children began showing higher rates of infant mortality, unusual physical characteristics, and developmental delays. What should have been warning signs were instead interpreted as evidence of their bloodline's sensitivity and refinement. The Habsburg, just that distinctive protruding lower mandible first, appeared as a minor family trait. Early portraits show it as almost aristocratic, a distinguishing feature that marked Habsburg blood. Court artists initially painted it as a sign of strength and noble bearing. No one realized they were documenting the beginning of a genetic catastrophe. More disturbing were the behavioral abnormalities that began appearing in Habsburg children. They showed unusual aggression, difficulty learning, and what modern psychology would recognize as severe developmental disorders. But in an era when royal eccentricity was often interpreted as divine inspiration, these symptoms were dismissed as evidence of royal superiority. The family's response to these early warning signs was to double down on their breeding strategy. Instead of seeking marriage partners from outside their bloodline, they began marrying even closer relatives. Uncle-niece marriages became common, then preferred. The logic was twisted but internally consistent. If Habsburg blood was superior, then concentrating it further would produce even more superior offspring. Court physicians began noticing fertility problems, miscarriages, and stillbirths at rates far higher than normal. But rather than investigating genetic causes, they blamed external factors, diet, climate, political stress, or divine punishment for unrelated sins. The medical establishment was as invested in the fiction of Habsburg genetic superiority as the family itself. Emperor Charles V, despite ruling the largest empire in human history, was the product of significant inbreeding. His parents were cousins, his grandparents were related, and his great-grandparents shared multiple common ancestors. But Charles was still functional intelligent, capable of ruling, and relatively normal in appearance. He represented the last generation before the genetic damage became truly catastrophic. The real horror began when Charles's son, Philip II, married his own niece, creating a genetic bottleneck that would doom all their descendants. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a deliberate breeding program designed to concentrate Habsburg traits. The family had become convinced that their genetic superiority was so valuable that diluting it with foreign blood would be a betrayal of their divine mission. Philip II's children began showing more severe manifestations of the Habsburg curse. The jaw became more pronounced, intellectual disabilities more common, and physical deformities more severe. But rather than recognizing these as symptoms of inbreeding, the family interpreted them as evidence of their bloodlines increasing purity and spiritual refinement. The most disturbing aspect was how the family celebrated these genetic abnormalities. They commissioned portraits that emphasized their distinctive features, created elaborate theories about the spiritual significance of their physical differences, and used their increasingly bizarre appearance as proof of their divine appointment. To rule, the moment the Habsburg curse became irreversible came with the marriage of Philip IV of Spain to his niece, Mariana of Austria, in 1649. This union represented the complete collapse of genetic diversity within the Habsburg bloodline. The bride and groom shared so many common ancestors that they were more closely related than typical brothers and sisters. Their children were genetic catastrophes. The future Charles II of Spain was born with physical deformities so severe that court physicians initially doubted he would survive infancy. His tongue was so enlarged that he couldn't speak clearly until age 4. His jaw protruded so far that he couldn't chew solid food throughout his entire life. His body was so weak that he couldn't walk without assistance till age 8. But the physical deformities were nothing compared to the mental disabilities. Charles II was described by contemporary observers as having the intellectual capacity of a child throughout his adult life. He was unable to make basic decisions, couldn't understand complex concepts, and required constant supervision. Yet this genetically devastated human being was expected to rule one of the world's largest empires. The most horrifying aspect was how the family continued to view these catastrophic deformities as evidence of their genetic superiority, created elaborate theological explanations for Charles's disabilities, claiming they were signs of divine favor and spiritual refinement. The more damaged their children became, the more convinced they became of their bloodline's special status. The peak of Habsburg genetic destruction was reached with Charles II, a human being so genetically damaged that modern scientists struggle to understand how he survived to adulthood. His autopsy revealed internal organs that were barely functional, bones that were malformed, and a body that was essentially a collection of genetic mistakes held together by royal privilege. Charles II's attempts to produce an heir became a grotesque farce that lasted for decades. He was married twice to genetically healthy women, but his reproductive system was so damaged that conception was impossible. Court physicians performed increasingly desperate and invasive procedures, trying to enable the king to father children. The medical records from this period read like horror stories of surgical torture. The most disturbing aspect was how the court continued to maintain the fiction of royal dignity around this genetic wreckage. Charles II was dressed in elaborate royal costumes that couldn't hide his deformities, seated on thrones that he couldn't sit in properly, and expected to perform royal duties that were far beyond his capabilities. When Charles II finally died in 1700, the autopsy report described internal organs so damaged that physicians couldn't understand how he had lived at all. The death of Charles II marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line and triggered the War of Spanish Succession, one of the most devastating conflicts in European history. The genetic curse that had been building for 3 centuries had finally achieved its ultimate goal: the complete extinction of the bloodline that had once ruled half the world. The Austrian branch of the Habsburg family, while still surviving, had to confront the reality that their breeding practices had created a genetic dead end. They began desperately seeking marriage partners from outside their bloodline, but the damage was largely irreversible. Centuries of inbreeding had created genetic problems that would continue to manifest for generations. The medical establishment finally began to understand the connection between inbreeding and genetic disorders. Charles II's autopsy became a turning point in medical history, providing clear evidence of how genetic concentration could produce catastrophic health problems. This knowledge would eventually lead to the development of modern genetics. The most devastating consequence was the psychological impact on the surviving Habsburg family members. They had to confront the reality that their centuries-long breeding program had been a form of slow-motion genocide, systematically destroying their own bloodline in pursuit of an impossible ideal of genetic purity. The systematic erasure of the Habsburg genetic curse began almost immediately after Charles II's death. The family couldn't afford to have their 3-century breeding program exposed as a catastrophic failure, so they began an elaborate campaign of historical revisionism that would last for centuries. Official court records were edited to remove references to the most severe genetic abnormalities. Portrait artists were instructed to paint later Habsburg rulers with more normal proportions, gradually erasing the visual evidence of their genetic degeneration. The famous Habsburg jaw was reinterpreted as a sign of strength and determination, rather than genetic damage. When a family has absolute authority over their own reproduction, when no one can question their decisions, and their beliefs are reinforced by centuries of success, they can pursue even the most self-destructive strategies with complete conviction. Habsburg curse teaches us that genetic diversity isn't just a scientific concept, it's a survival strategy. The very thing that makes populations strong is the thing that elites often reject: mixing with outsiders, accepting foreign influence, and acknowledging that purity is actually weakness disguised as strength. The family that lived for 300 years with one genetic curse teaches us that the most dangerous enemies aren't external threats, they're the internal obsessions that absolute power allows us to pursue without limits. Sometimes the greatest act of self-preservation is the willingness to admit that our most cherished beliefs might be slowly killing us.